Welcome back to Evidence-Based Practice in ABA. This is video part 2. We're going to now talk about developing and evaluating effective educational programs in the IEP. Let's take a look at your objectives. The first is to identify IEP team members required by IDEA, identify and discriminate between essential IEP components, and that's after we've done a brief overview of what the IEP is. Identify and discriminate between 5 general criteria for choosing interventions and evaluating intervention effectiveness. 4 is to identify 2 important factors to consider before trying to interpret data collected during the assessment. 5 is to define IOA and procedural fidelity, discriminate between them in examples, and identify thresholds for acceptable IOA and fidelity. 6, identify intervention evaluation and discontinuation considerations. In other words, considerations pertaining to evaluating and discontinuing or revising an intervention. And then identify situations in which to consider discontinuing or revising interventions. So first, let's do a brief overview of the IEP, and this is from Bill Heward's special education text in 2009. This is a quote from page 65. He says, an individualized education program, IEP, is a system for spelling out where the child is, where she should be going, how she will get there, how long it will take, and how to tell if and when she has arrived. So an IEP is both a roadmap and a system for accountability and documentation pertaining to the student's academic achievement and acquisition of functional life skills specified in their annual goals. So the IEP holds teachers and schools accountable, provides a basis on which to judge their effectiveness related to helping children or helping the student meet their goals and objectives. And school districts are legally mandated to provide the special education and related services in the IEP and provide documentation that a systematic effort was undertaken to achieve the goals and objectives in the IEP. So in other words, the IEP is a document that spells out the students' current levels of functioning, what their goals are, when and how they're going to be evaluated, how progress is going to be determined, who's going to determine it, and it serves as a basis for evaluating whether the teachers and the school in general has made and documented that they've made a systematic, concerted, and intensive and high quality attempt to help the student meet their goals and objectives. Now the IEP team composition specified by IDEA is the following. 1, the team should consist of a parent of the child with a disability. So notice what I'm talking about here is not the contents of the IEP, which is the document, but the composition of the IEP team, who's involved. So you have the parent of the child with a disability. Well, and the second is at least one general education teacher if the student will spend some time in a general education classroom. That means if some attempt is going to be made at inclusion in general education classroom. 3 is at least one special education teacher. 4 is a representative of the local education agency, in other words, a representative of the school or school district. 5, someone who can interpret the instructional implications of evaluations or assessments and the results, because what good are the assessments and evaluations if there aren't folks in the IEP team who can appropriately and accurately interpret the results and make informed decisions based on those results. Other individuals who are knowledgeable or have special expertise related to the child's needs and other services. So for example, if a student has a pediatric feeding disorder then the team might include a behavior analyst who specializes in assessment and treatment of pediatric feeding disorders. If the feeding disorder is severe, it might even include a multidisciplinary team, which could include medical professionals, speech-language pathologists, occupational therapists. Students with multiple severe disabilities may, have other individuals on the IEP team, such as physical therapists or medical professionals who specialize in any technology used to assist the students, such as like a breathing apparatus. And then when appropriate, the child with the disability should attend the IEP. In other words, should comprise the team and attend those IEP team meetings. So your first ASR is if the student will spend some time in a general education classroom, their IEP team should include at least A, one general education teacher, B, one special education teacher, C, a specialist to interpret assessment results, or D, all of the above. Give a few more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll, and the answer is D, all of the above. Now let's look at we've looked at the composition of the IEP team. Now let's look at the essential IEP components. Again, this is according to Bill Heward in 2009. The first is a statement of the child's current levels of academic achievement and functioning. Academically, what is the child able to do? What have they demonstrated they can do? And in terms of functioning, we're talking about also functional life skills and self-care, social skills, and so forth. Measurable annual goals, which should include academic and functional life skill goals. So in other words, a comprehensive, highly individualized curriculum that's described in an objective, observable, measurable way. A statement of how progress towards annual goals will be measured and reported. In other words, quarterly reports. And this is one of the essential IEP components that we're going to focus on largely in this unit as we talk about evidence-based practice. That is a statement of the special education and related services and supplementary aids and services based on peer-reviewed research to the extent practicable, that means possible, to be provided to the child or on behalf of the child, and a statement of the program modifications or supports for school personnel that will be provided for the child. This is no easy task. This is actually a very complicated, very difficult essential IEP component. And in this unit, you're going to get an introduction to evidence-based practices and interpreting scientific literature and interventions, specifically behavioral interventions, that will provide a framework for you and a foundation going forward for doing just this, helping the IEP team select and evaluate appropriate behavioral interventions based on peer-reviewed research. That means research, scientific research, experiments essentially published in peer-reviewed scientific journals like the Journal of Applied Behavioral Analysis, Behavior Modification, Behavioral Interventions, Developmental Neurorehabilitation, and I could go on. Education and treatment of children. No, okay, so now number 5, this fifth essential IEP component is an explanation of the extent to which the child will not participate with students without disabilities in general education classes or in typical activities. Okay. Number 6 is appropriate accommodations required to assess academic achievement and functional skills on state and district-wide assessments, or information about required alternative assessments. Number 7, the anticipated date of the start of services and modifications described above, and the frequency, location, and duration of those services and modifications. for example, the student will begin to receive weekly speech therapy as they're pulled out from their special education classroom once a week for 30 minutes. Alright, and that's an example. And starting on, I don't know, October 1st, just making something up there. Alright, now, but for students who are 16 and older, information on supporting the child's transition to adulthood and post-school life are essential. That's an essential component. There's an 8th essential component, basically, when students are 16 or older. And sometimes this component is incorporated into the IEP at an early age. I think as early as 14, if I remember correctly. Okay, here's our next ASR. ASR number 2. Which of the following is not an essential IEP component? A. Measurable annual goals. B. Appropriate accommodations required to assess academic achievement and functional skills. C. The child's parent. D. A statement of how progress towards annual goals will be measured and reported, such as quarterly reports. Give you a couple more seconds. Okay, I'll close the poll, and the answer here is C. The child's parent. So note that the child's parent is an IEP team member, but not a component of the IEP itself. All the others listed here are components of the IEP. ASR 3. The IEP should include the anticipated date of the start of services and modifications described above, and the A. Frequency of those services and modifications. B. Location of those services and modifications. C. Duration of those services and modifications. Or D. All of the above. Couple more seconds. Okay, I'll close the poll, and the answer is D, all of the above. ASR 4. An essential component of the IEP is an explanation of the extent to which the child will participate with students with disabilities in atypical activities. Is that A, true, or B, false? Couple more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll, and the answer here is B, false. Alright, now interventions are selected to address the student's IEP goals. And sometimes IEP teams consider multiple programs or interventions. And so the authors of your text describe 5 general criteria for choosing interventions and evaluating intervention effectiveness. The first is intervention outcomes. The second is potential intervention risk. The third is evidence. The fourth is considering alternatives. And the fifth is program evaluation. And we're going to look at each one of these in detail. So let's look at intervention outcomes. The IEP team should consider if expected outcomes match the student's goals and individual needs. Okay, so this is all about, for intervention outcomes, we're talking about the extent to which expected outcomes match the student's goals and individual needs. So it's important to calibrate the expected outcomes based on the type of intervention. Now, regardless of the intervention and expected outcome, the IEP team should be prepared to use ongoing data collection, progress monitoring, and intensive evaluation and revision of the program to ensure that the student meets their goals. Okay, now in the context of the evidence-based practice of ABA, which we'll get into more later, this aspect of the IEP corresponds to considering the best available evidence. And again, we'll talk about that later. So for now, just know that part of evidence-based practice in ABA in the context of the IEP is to examine studies in the literature that evaluated interventions and included participants' characteristics or problems similar to your student. To the extent that they're similar, your student is more likely to respond positively to the intervention. That is, by taking that step in the evidence-based practice of ABA, you're ensuring that expected outcomes match the student's goals and individual needs. That is, the expected outcomes of the intervention that are being proposed. Let's look at potential intervention risk. Okay? Once the IEP team is in agreement that the student's goals and likely intervention outcomes are aligned and appropriate, then the next step is to consider any potential risks to the student, their family, peers, or other community members. So we're not talking about just the risk to the student, but also other people involved in the intervention. Okay? Or people who aren't directly involved in the intervention. The family might not be involved in interventions implemented at school, but they still may be affected. The amount of time, resources, and energy invested in the student's educational program is extensive. So it's really important that the team considers what may be the cost if the intervention fails. Okay. This is one of the reasons also why it's really important to use function-based interventions of challenging behavior based on the results of functional analysis. So you should remember something about that from SP 3633. But basically the best, most effective approach for replacing challenging behavior with socially appropriate alternative behavior is to implement an intervention that addresses the function of the challenging behavior, be it as maintained by escape or avoidance, tangibles, attention. In general, you use differential reinforcement, where you place challenging topographies on extinction, that is, you withhold the reinforcer, and then when socially appropriate alternative topographies occur, you deliver the same reinforcer that was maintaining challenging behavior. And what happens is you have a transformation of the structure or the topography of their behavior under those conditions. They start to behave more appropriately. And so what you don't want to do is take a trial and error approach to intervention and implement interventions for challenging behavior where the function doesn't match, right? The intervention doesn't match the function of the behavior. So, because doing so can put the student and others at increased risk and waste time, resources, and energy. It's really best to conduct a functional analysis to get the highest quality evidence which leads to the most certainty about the function of the behavior, and which ultimately leads to selection of the most appropriate and effective intervention. Yeah, I would just say also consider a student with challenging behavior who receives functional communication training. This is a significant focus of his IEP, and the purpose is to replace challenging behavior with manding. Now, if delays to reinforcement, intermittent reinforcement, and demand fading aren't implemented to ensure that the student also benefits from academic or life skills instruction, then we might say that the cost of implementing a program so heavily focused on SET may be too high. That's another example. ASR 5. Regarding intervention outcomes, the IEP team should carefully consider if the expected outcomes, A, match the district's expectations, B, match those demonstrated in research, C, match the student's goals and individual needs, or D, were obtained under conditions of minimal risk. Give a few more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll, and the answer here is C, match the student's goals and individual needs. That's the primary idea behind the intervention outcomes aspect of this, is a focus on a match between the student's goals and their intervention and their individual needs and the expected outcome of the intervention that's going to be implemented. ASR 6. Regarding risk assessment, you consider A, risk to the student, B, risk to peers, C, risk to the family, or D, all of the above. A couple more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll, and the answer is D, all of the above. ASR 7, time, resources, and energy invested in the student's educational program is extensive. So for these reasons, it is important to carefully consider the A, risk associated with certain interventions, or B, the outcomes obtained from the intervention. A couple more seconds. Alright, I'll go ahead and close the poll. And the answer here is A, risk associated with certain interventions. Remember, as a criterion for selecting interventions in IEPs, considering intervention outcomes refers to whether expected outcomes match the student's goals and individual needs, and how that match will be determined. Next is evidence. Schools are held accountable for student progress. The best and most objective way to assess the evidential certainty of interventions is to use ABA-based instruction intensively, in collaboration with parents and other caregivers, including generalization programming, using single-subject experimental design methodology. And notice here I'm putting an emphasis on generalization programming because it's not enough to focus on the acquisition of new knowledge and skills, but their application in real-world novel scenarios and situations and conditions. Considering alternatives. Now, some interventions affect a student's access to other interventions, okay? And so it's critical to make sure that as alternative interventions are considered, that their evidence base guides their selection, okay? As opposed to philosophical perspectives or certain belief systems or preferences or even resources, right? Or the intuitive appeal of the alternative intervention, or even strong emotional appeals from anecdotal sources who swear that intervention's great. It needs to be based on the evidence base, the scientific evidence base. So, for example, there are some interventions that are incompatible and may even interfere with one another. Okay, so it's not just a problem when you're selecting alternative interventions that you may select one that doesn't have an evidence base or a strong evidence base, but you also might select an intervention that interferes with the effects of an evidence-based intervention. So an example comes from Peterson and colleagues in 2016, and this was a feeding intervention study. And Peterson and colleagues compared a non-evidence-based intervention for food selectivity in children with autism called the sequential oral sensory approach to an evidence-based ABA approach. The ABA approach involves withholding reinforcement for inappropriate mealtime behavior. It's an essential component of the effectiveness of that intervention. Now, only the ABA approach was effective at improving feeding. In the ABA approach, reinforcement was withheld for inappropriate mealtime behavior, but this was not the case for the SOS approach. Okay, so the researchers demonstrated that these approaches are incompatible. The sequential oral sensory approach being the alternative intervention that lacks an evidence base, and then the ABA approach, which is strongly supported by empirical research. Okay, now let's look at program evaluation. Now, if a given intervention meets all of the previous criteria, which are the IEP goals are appropriately supported by the intervention, the risk is low and manageable, there is objective empirical, that is scientific support for the intervention's effectiveness, and it's compatible with other interventions included in the IEP, then the next step is to consider how the effectiveness of the intervention will be evaluated for your individual student. The intervention's effects can be assessed indirectly or directly. Examples of indirect assessment include parent satisfaction questionnaires, social validity questionnaires. Now, direct assessment consists of observation and data collection on behavior. Now, direct observation with intensive data collection and graphing is the most valid and useful form of assessment or evaluation for ensuring that an intervention is effective. Assessment of the intervention's effects don't start and end or occur on some days but not others. Assessment is a continuous process that starts when the intervention is conceptualized and ends when the student's goal is met, and follow-up has verified that improvements maintained over time and generalized. ASR 8. After IEP goals are appropriately supported by the intervention, the risk is low and manageable. There's objective empirical support for the intervention's effectiveness, and it's compatible with other interventions included in the IEP. What should be considered next? A. Social validity. B. Procedures for evaluating effectiveness. C. The single subject design. Or D. Time and resources. A couple more seconds. Alright, I'll go ahead and close the poll. And the answer here is B. It's procedures for evaluating effectiveness. Once all the other elements have been established or criteria have been met, pertain to selection of the intervention and its match to the student and its expected outcomes and match to IEP goals and these other elements here. Once that's all been established, the next step is to select procedures for evaluating effectiveness. ASR 9, parent satisfaction questionnaires and social validity questionnaires are which approach to assessing intervention effectiveness? A. Indirect assessment, or B. Direct assessment? A couple more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll, and the answer is A. Indirect assessment. ASR 10, best practice in assessing intervention effectiveness is A. Indirect assessment, or B. Direct assessment? A couple more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll, and the answer is B. Direct assessment. Now, there are two important factors to consider before trying to interpret data collected during the assessment, that is, during the evaluation or the assessment of the intervention's effectiveness: believability and procedural fidelity. Now, the believability of the data is synonymous with truth. What is the truth about what happened? During observation, what did the student really do? Alright, so the believability of the data is established by assessing inter-observer agreement. IOA. And IOA is the extent to which the data agree from two or more independent observers collecting data during the same observation period. This should be familiar from SP 3633. IOA determines the integrity of the dependent variable, that aspect of behavior that's being measured in the evaluation of the intervention's effects. If IOA falls below 90%, that means that the data may not accurately represent the amounts of behavior that actually occurred. Below 80%, the data are invalid. Now, additional training, refinements in operational definitions, or job aids such as checklists and flowcharts may improve IOA. And IOA should be assessed routinely and periodically across the intervention at different time points, because low IOA can signal that some additional training or refinements in the operational definitions or job aids need to be implemented to increase the accuracy and believability of the data. Only when you have believable data can you warrant drawing conclusions from those data. Okay, next is procedural fidelity. All right, you can think of procedural fidelity as being on target with respect to implementing the intervention as it was planned. Procedural fidelity is an assessment used to determine the extent to which an intervention has been implemented as it was planned or intended to be. There are two general types of errors in procedural fidelity. One is an error of omission. That means an element of the intervention was not implemented. And an error of commission, which means an unplanned intervention component was added. Now, procedural fidelity assessments determine the integrity of the independent variable. Not the dependent variable, that's what you measure. That's the student's behavior, some aspect of the student's behavior you're measuring. The independent variable is the intervention or a component of the intervention in the treatment package. If you find low procedural fidelity, the effects of the intervention cannot be determined, and you need 90% or better fidelity in general to conduct a valid evaluation of the intervention's effects. Now, procedural fidelity can be improved with job aids, like checklists, flowcharts, and additional training of the person implementing the intervention. There is an abundance of scientific literature on behavioral methods for training staff. For example, you can actually find studies that looked at the best way to train practitioners to use functional analysis or stimulus preference assessment, discrete trial training, pivotal response treatment, and more. The gold standard is behavioral skills training, which uses instruction, modeling, rehearsal, opportunities to practice, and feedback until the trainee implements the intervention with a level of accuracy that meets or exceeds a predetermined performance criterion, such as 90% or better procedural fidelity across 3 consecutive training sessions. So that defining that really special characteristic of behavioral skills training that separates it from similar training that other professions do or other disciplines is that mastery criterion, that practice and feedback continue until the learner demonstrates mastery. ASR 11. What do you need to properly interpret program evaluation data pertaining to interventions? You need A, high IOA, high fidelity, B, low IOA, low fidelity, C, high IOA, low fidelity. A couple more seconds. All right, I'll close the poll. The answer is A, high IOA and high fidelity. ASR 12. Assessing dependent variable integrity means assessing A, data collection practices, or B, intervention implementation. A couple more seconds. All right, I'll close the poll. And the answer is A, data collection practices. ASR 13. IV integrity is related to A, IOA assessment, or B, procedural fidelity assessment. Couple more seconds. All right, I'll close the poll. The answer is B, procedural fidelity assessment. Now there are a few other program evaluation considerations, so which should be determined during the IEP process, and they include A, who will take responsibility for evaluating the effects of the intervention, B, how often the intervention will be evaluated, and C, criteria for when the intervention will be discontinued. So let's look at who's responsible first. Now, the person responsible for evaluating the intervention's effects must have the appropriate experience and training to conduct the evaluation properly. So individuals may include persons within the school district, such as the teacher, classroom paraprofessionals, district behavior or autism specialists, speech and language pathologists with ABA training, or external to the district, such as a consultant BCBA. And so how often do you evaluate? Well, the intervention should be evaluated as often as possible because it's the evaluation itself that leads to the best decision making. You don't want a student's intervention to be in place for more than a couple days without examining graph data so that you're making timely, appropriate intervention decisions at all times. And with some exceptions, okay, so evaluation and assessment, with some exceptions, evaluation and assessment are continuous in that they're conducted daily. But there are some exceptions where maybe you would only assess or evaluate every few days or on a weekly basis or on a bi-weekly basis. It really depends. But in general, you should expect to be evaluating and assessing every day. ASR 14. Who is responsible for assessing outcomes and intervention effects? Teachers. A. Teachers. B. Classroom paraprofessionals. C. District or autism specialists or D, could be any of the above. Couple more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll, and the answer is D, could be any of the above. Now, another consideration here is when to discontinue. When do you discontinue the intervention? And there can be a lot of different situations in which that would be appropriate. But we're just going to list a few that your textbook highlights. These are examples of situations in which the intervention would be discontinued. They include A, that the student's goal was met and improvement maintained over time and generalized. Or B, the intervention had adverse effects on the student, peers, or family. Another is that teachers or paraprofessionals, despite investing time and resources in training, were not able to implement with fidelity. Or D, there were no notable improvements in the behavior that were observed after a reasonable period of time was given for the intervention to have an effect. And depending on the intervention, that could be every 3 days, or in 3 days, or 3 weeks, or a month. It just depends. In some cases, you wouldn't want to just discontinue. You may want to revise an intervention. So, in some cases, we're talking about not just deciding to discontinue an intervention, but discontinue or revise. Now, the Greek philosopher Heraclitus said, "The only thing that is constant is change." Okay? And that's true in our case as well. The students with autism have the disorder throughout their life. As they learn and grow, their abilities and needs change, so their educational program needs to undergo changes too. For example, in kindergarten, learning the alphabet is pretty important. In 5th grade, reading comprehension is more important. With students with autism near adult age and approach post-school transition, interpreting and responding to job postings and reading an employee handbook at their first job become much more pressing matters. So as their needs change, the educational program needs to undergo changes too. ASR 15. An intervention was implemented at school to decrease challenging behavior, and it worked. But challenging behavior increased at home. It created increased parental stress and resulted in the parent demanding help at home. This scenario represents which consideration pertaining to discontinuing or revising an intervention? Is it A, improvements maintained and generalized, B, no notable improvements in behavior, C, low treatment fidelity, or D, adverse effects? Couple more seconds. Alright, I'll close the poll. In this case, the answer is D, because the intervention seems to have had what is called a behavioral contrast effect. That means a decrease in the behavior in one setting has increased the behavior in another setting, and it's causing major problems for the family. It's having major adverse effects, and so a serious consideration needs to be given to quickly discontinuing or revising that intervention. Alright, that wraps up this video part. I'll see you in the next video part where we'll talk about common ways in which education programs fail. See you then.